This is Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, and we are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. This is a very politically perilous time in American history, to put it mildly. Your engagement is the sine qua non, listeners.
On today's program, we were going to highlight a demonstration that took place in Battle Creek, Michigan last month, which called for a boycott of Kellogg's for using artificial dyes that have been linked to various health problems and have been banned in Europe. According to our very own corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, in 2015, Kellogg's announced that it was going to remove all artificial flavors and colors from its cereals by 2018, especially the ones containing a preservative called BHT. 9 years later, they haven't done it. The demonstration was organized and led by activist and blogger Vani Hari, also known as the Food Babe. It took place about a month ago, so we've invited Ms. Hari on to give us a full report on Kellogg's response. Ms. Hari will also take us through what unhealthy additives she has been battling to get out of many other processed foods like Gatorade, Skittles, Doritos, and Kraft macaroni and cheese. That's the first half of the show. In the second half, we welcome back labor union organizer Chris Townsend to discuss the state of the labor movement in America today, and specifically about what he considers the out-of-touch labor leadership and its unconditional support of the Democratic Party that helped contribute to the election of Donald Trump. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, can we at least get petroleum products out of Fruit Loops? David?
Vani Hari is an author and food activist, a former corporate consultant. She started the Food Babe blog in 2011, and she is the co-founder of the nutritional supplement startup Truvani. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Vani Hari.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, welcome indeed. You know, it's for our listeners who are politically correct. Food Babe is Vani Hari's own designation, right?
Only the gentlemen say that. It's so funny. Yeah, I never wanted to call the blog Food Babe. I wanted to call it eathealthyliveforever.com. But my husband, who's a tech geek in the family, said no one would remember that. And he came up with the word Food Babe. And I said, wow, that's pretty catchy. But, why don't I teach people to become food babes in their life? And that's how it all started. So thank you.
Okay, well, it does get people's attention. So your husband was right on that point. I want to provide a little context for the specifics that we're going to ask you to get into company by company, because you name names. You don't deal with anonymous corporate power statements. You name the names of the food companies that have their products on the breakfast tables of everyday American family. Now, there was a hearing that you were one of the star witnesses in the Senate. It was an informal roundtable by Senator Ron Johnson, Republican Wisconsin, one of my least favorite senators, but as illustrating that your appeal crosses political label boundaries. He had a roundtable with you, but he had other experts as well, and it was on September 23rd, got a huge number of visits as it was streamed. And one of the experts he had on this roundtable, who we had on our program, was Dr. Marty McCary, who is a gastrointestinal surgeon at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in Baltimore. And he happens to be the author of a best-selling book just out called Blind Spots: When Medicine Gets It Wrong and What It Means for Our Health. He's being rumored to possibly join the Trump administration Department of Health and Human Services, and here is why he is being considered. He said at the hearing, and this provides real context for our lead-off interview, he said the following, quote, "My group at Johns Hopkins does more pancreatic cancer surgery than any hospital in the United States, but at no point in the last 20 years has anyone stopped to ask, why has pancreatic cancer doubled over those 20 years?" End quote, McCary said. Continuing, quote, "Who's working on that? Who's looking into it? We are so busy in our healthcare system billing and coding and paying each other, and every stakeholder has their gigantic lobby in Washington, D.C., and everybody's making a lot of money except for one stakeholder, the American citizen, end quote. Continuing, quote, can we be real for a second? He said to the committee chair. We have poisoned our food supply, engineered highly addictive chemicals that we put into our food. We spray it with pesticides that kill pests. What do you think they do to our gut lining and our microbiome? And then they come in sick. The GI tract is reacting. It's not an acute inflammatory storm. It's a low-grade chronic inflammation, and it makes people feel sick. And that inflammation drives so many of our chronic diseases that we didn't see half a century ago. Who's working on who's looking into this? Who's talking about it? Our healthcare system is playing whack-a-mole on the back end, and we are not talking about the root causes of our chronic disease epidemic. We can't see the forest from the trees. The country is getting sicker. We can't keep going down this path. We have the most over-medicated, sickest population in the world, and no one's talking about the root causes, end quote. We have now Vani Hari, who has broken new ground and illustrated an important point that I illustrated many years ago, that these giant companies control the regulatory agencies like the Food and Drug Administration. They can bog down our lawyers filing petitions to get junk out of junk food for years. But what Vani Hari has shown is that you go direct action on brand name companies where the brand name itself is worth billions of dollars in their accounting and material. Just the brand name of the product is worth billions of dollars. And if you can expose that brand name, tarnish it verifiably with information about what that brand name contains and harmful additives, then they're going to listen to you. And that's why they're listening to Vani Hari. She also discovered a very powerful lever, that a lot of these bad chemicals are banned in countries like Western Europe. Same product, same company. Why are they allowed in the U.S.? So we're going to take it from there, and I want to ask you 1, 2, 3 type questions about your successes here. Let's start with Gatorade.
Yeah. So Gatorade here in the United States, they use red 40 and caramel color. In Germany, they do not. They use carrot and sweet potatoes to color their Gatorade. It's a travesty that we allow American food companies to use poisonous chemicals that are made from petroleum and coal tar here in the United States, or ammonia in the fact of caramel color. And they are using real food ingredients in other countries. These are American iconic companies. And this example of Gatorade alone kind of highlights the bigger issue here in terms of our food system, how screwed up it is.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you. So all these athletes we see on TV in the football games on the sideline, they're drinking Gatorade. They're still drinking these Gatorades with the bad additives that are banned in countries like Germany. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So you haven't yet gotten Gatorade to clean up their act yet, right?
No, they have not.
Okay.
And I would say, PepsiCo is one of the largest brands that's guilty in this. I mean, I would think Frito-Lay, who they own, Doritos, Cheetos, all of those brands of products have artificial food dyes linked to hyperactivity in children, are contaminated with carcinogens because of the way they're produced from petroleum and coal tar. So yeah, they're definitely guilty of this. So,
Okay. And who owns Gatorade?
PepsiCo.
Okay. Now, you see, when Phil Donahue had his huge television show every weekday, you would be on Phil Donahue doing exactly what I'm trying to have you do on this interview. Go company by company, product by company, product by product. So I'm just going to name them, and you don't have to go into much more detail than your wonderful interview in the current issue just out of the Capitol Citizen. That's what I'm drawing on, listeners. You can get to CapitolCitizen.com and find out how you can obtain a copy by immediate first-class mail. So I'm going to go through the names and just make the point, and then we'll go to the next name. We'll start with Skittles.
Yeah, Skittles here in the United States has 10 artificial food dyes in an ingredient that's banned in Europe called titanium dioxide because it causes DNA damage.
Okay, let's go to Doritos.
Doritos in the U.S. has 3 different artificial food dyes and MSG, monosodium glutamate, and the UK version does not.
General Mills is playing tricks on us, you say. Explain.
Yeah, in Australia, they just launched a version of Trix on the cover of the box. It says no artificial dyes. They actually advertise that. In the United States, they still have artificial food dyes. And actually, in the Wall Street Journal just yesterday, it was reported that I sent General Mills a letter asking them to remove artificial food dyes. So now they're being put on notice like Kellogg's.
Okay, I just saw an ad on TV portraying macaroni and cheese by Kraft.
Yeah. Back before 2013, Kraft was using paprika and beta carotene only in the UK to color their mac and cheese. But here in the United States, they were using yellow 5 and yellow 6. Actually, yellow 5 and yellow 6 are ingredients that the Wall Street Journal just reported actually on recently, that it turns lab animals transparent, their skin, the skin of mice transparent. Such a bizarre, wild finding, but also is ingredients that can be contaminated with carcinogens and also linked to eczema and asthma and other autoimmune disorders in kids. So this was something that I started a petition on in 2013, got over 386,000 signatures, took those signatures to Kraft headquarters. They let me in and had a meeting with me, but they told me we have to agree to disagree. But we didn't stop there. We continued to spread the message, and we were able to change their market share because their customers went from their product to their competitor, Annie's, and then Annie's got bought by General Mills for $800 million. And then Kraft had to do something about it. And so they ended up changing. So that now you will find no artificial food dyes in Kraft macaroni and cheese.
Okay, victory for Vani Hari and her hundreds of thousands of people who signed the petitions. I want to point out the strategy here, listeners. The consumer groups in Washington, D.C. now who work on food approach it with lawyers. They hurl lawyers against the corporate lawyers who outnumber them 100 to 1 before these regulatory agencies. And these corporate lawyers know how to game the system. They're brilliant in delaying, obfuscating, getting their people to run the FDA like it's going to occur in January again. What Vani Hari is doing is hurling the consumers, the mothers, the fathers, the youngsters against the brand, the corporate brand. The corporate brand is on TV every day. It's published and promoted every day. It cannot be defended and camouflaged by lawyers. So it's hurling against the brand. That is the power that she has with all her collaborators. And the other power is to show that other countries, whether it's Canada, Japan, Taiwan, Western Europe, have taken action, not all of them at the same time, with the same U.S. company and the same product, and cleaned out some of these harmful additives. And by the way, their full harm is not documented. The government's
Correct.
way behind in testing the full documentation. That's what Dr. McCary was really referring. The impact on the gut. They talk about, is it cancerous?
Yeah.
But he's talking about the inflammation on the gut. So now you talk about the game of whack-a-mole. What is that about?
Yeah, I've been spending my last, over 10 years working on these issues, and it's me and the grassroots movement that we've created, taking on these corporations. And it is a game of whack-a-mole because we get these corporations to change, or, they announce that they're going to change and then they go back on their commitment. And that is what's happened with Kellogg's. In 2015, they said that they would remove these artificial food dyes, and they were celebrated across the media for making this announcement. And they had so much worldwide press on they're removing these artificial food dyes, but they never did it. Instead, they started to create more cereals targeting the littlest of children, like Baby Shark cereal, taking the most popular toddler songs and making cereals marketed towards them with these artificial food dyes. So not only did they lie to the American public, they started to create new cereals. So I was fed up. And why is it consumers like myself and activists like myself have to hold these companies accountable? Shouldn't the politicians in Washington be doing this? And when I had the opportunity to sit in that Senate roundtable and look at Senator Ron Johnson in the eye and ask him that question, it was absolutely electric. Everybody in the room did a standing ovation. And in that room, too, was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And I know he could feel the energy of these issues. And this is one of the reasons why shortly thereafter, he started talking about this as being one of the first things he's going to take on if he's given a powerful position under the Trump administration, which is now he's been appointed as the HHS secretary, or nominated rather. And so he said, the first thing I'm going to do is ask the cereal companies to remove dyes. I can't even believe that we are being heard at the highest levels in Washington like this right now. And so I hope that we can stop the game of whack-a-mole with leadership like that in Washington. And again, I'm not holding my breath because I've been in this situation before where there's been a lot of promises made and not a lot done. So we have to see what we can get done.
Well, Vani Hari, let's get closer to home here. These ingredients basically can be described as silent violence. That's the way they escape accountability, because people don't feel it right away. It just builds up. Suddenly they've got a gut problem. Suddenly you have a cancer problem. And the causation tends to be vague because they're dealing with silent violence, not like a street crime attack in a back alley or whatever. So let's talk about Canada. Kellogg's is selling Fruit Loops, boxes of Fruit Loops in the U.S. and in Canada. Exact same product. What's the difference?
In Canada, they're using juice extracts to color their cereal from carrot, watermelon, and blueberry. Here in the United States, they're using 4 different artificial food dyes made from petroleum and coal tar. Here in the United States, they're also using a preservative called butylated hydroxytoluene, or BHT for short. And it is lining the packages of the plastic bags here in the United States of cereals so that they can keep the product on the shelf longer, stays crispier longer. But they don't use this in Canada and other countries. They don't use it in India. They don't use it in Australia. They don't use it in all of Europe.
And they do this not because it's cheaper, but because it stays on the shelf longer? Or is it both cheaper to use the artificial stuff and it stays on the shelf longer?
It's both, because an artificial food dye made from petroleum and coal tar can stay on the shelf indefinitely, and a natural dye breaks down over time.
Okay, Kellogg's in Battle Creek, Michigan. They're playing hardball with Vani Hari and 1,000 people that showed up.
You could say that they're playing hardball. I mean, the fact that they've ignored us, they wouldn't even let us in their corporate headquarters. We showed up with 1,000 people on the ground with us. It was absolutely incredible. We collected the biggest petition in food industry history. Now it's over 453,000 signatures. They still won't respond to me directly. It's absolutely incredible. They are telling the press that the colors we use in cereals have been deemed safe by scientific bodies around the world, looking at the totality of research. But when you look at the last 16 of 24 peer-reviewed studies on artificial food dyes, you see harm with children. And when you look at European regulators and how they have a warning label on any product that has an artificial food dyes that warns parents, like a cigarette type warning label that says may cause adverse effects on activity and attention in children, why would an entire regulatory body in Europe do that if there wasn't harm? Also want to say that they know they're causing harm because back in 2010, when this was enacted in Europe, they voluntarily removed these ingredients. So they had to look at what the regulations were saying in these new scientific findings, and they didn't change their products across the board. So I know if we get somehow this in a court setting where we can take on Kellogg's in a big way, I think it will be shown in documentation and through discovery that they know they're harming their kids. Because again, when they make this statement to the public, and they also make this statement to all of the media of the world, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, all these people that are asking them right now, I want to know, what is the scientific research they're looking at? But I bet if we ask them, they're not going to tell us. They're going to say it's proprietary information, and that's got to stop.
Okay, you've announced a boycott against Kellogg, and they're starting to feel it. You have the great-great-great-granddaughter of the company founder, W.K. Kellogg. She has signed on with your boycott.
Yeah.
And are you using shareholder action, too, to put more pressure on Kellogg? Is that one of your tools?
Yeah, that's what we did earlier this year in March. Jason Karp became a shareholder of Kellogg's, and he sent an activist letter to them, and he tried to set up a meeting with them. They wanted to bring the Consumer Brands Association with them, which is the biggest lobbying arm for big food. And they wanted to discuss the science. And he said, okay, well, I'll bring a few doctors with me. And when he wanted to do that, they squashed the meeting.
Well, you have some young children. What do you feed them for breakfast?
We make steel cut oatmeal overnight in a crock pot, and I have that ready first thing in the morning. And then they usually have 3 or 4 more other courses. It's hilarious. They love everything. I mean, we eat bacon and eggs and French toast, and I make it all with real food ingredients and homemade baked bread. And I feed them as much real food as possible, tons of fruits and vegetables. And we try to stay out of the pantry. We try to stay out of any kind of packaged processed good that's wrapped in plastic. We just try to eat as real as possible.
Well, some of these ingredients have been tied to attention deficit disorder among youngsters, among other things, as the discoveries start emerging through the trade secret camouflage of these companies. Let me ask this question. You are in touch with a lot of young parents. The Center for Science and Public Interest many years ago, under Dr. Michael Jacobson's direction, a PhD from MIT that I hired to my great pleasure, he would go on national TV and he would hold up these boxes of cereals and he'd say, here are these cereal flakes, 40% sugar in the cereal, built right in the cereal. What's the situation today?
The sugar content is still a big problem. Cereals are not the healthiest thing to be eating in the morning. There are some better for you cereal brands that are coming about, but really it's about eating as many whole foods as possible. So if we can get your kids to be eating like homemade granola or something like that with yogurt instead of going for the typical cereal, we just have to break this habit back in the day. I mean, I think the original intention of how cereal was invented has not been preserved. I mean, when I look back at the history of John Harvey Kellogg, who was W.K. Kellogg's brother, who invented cornflakes for his sanitarium for the helpful benefit of adding fiber to his patient's diet. One of the reasons why it became an industry is he let anyone come in and look at what he was doing with his patients. And Post actually came in and did that. And they created Post. And his brother was really upset that, his other brother was giving away these trade secrets. And he's like, wait a minute, we need to sell this product too. And so that's how cornflakes was, brought to the market. And so cornflakes is a lot different than Fruit Loops, right? Fruit Loops is an abomination of any kind of healthful product that we should give our children, but it's served in schools every single day in the United States. It's absolutely a travesty. And when we look at the chronic disease rates that are happening in this country, especially the latest figures out of the USDA, that preteens ages of 12 to 18 are 38% of them are pre-diabetic. We have to change that trajectory.
Let's talk about obesity here. These companies have known for years that their junk food, very heavy salt, very heavy fat, very heavy sugar, increases the weight of these youngsters as they hook them. There's actually a lot of evidence that there's an addictive issue here that these companies and their so-called nutritionists and other scientists have known full well. So now we have 75% of the American people, including youngsters, who are either overweight or obese, 75%. That's more than double what it was just 24 years ago in 1990. That means you're going to have more diabetic peril, high blood pressure coming on earlier, all kinds of other problems that occur and have been reported. Now, if individuals planned this, it would be an indictable offense. It would be a tort that they're inflicting, a wrongful injury. But corporations are artificial persons. They escape and they camouflage their top executives. I want you to tell our listeners what the names of some of these CEOs are of these companies that you've been challenging.
Well, I'll tell you this. Jeff Hammering and Gary Pilnick are the two CEOs of Kellogg's and General Mills. And right now, they're putting their profits well above our American health. And they have an opportunity right now to be the leader in starting this movement where we're going to stop American companies from poisoning us with ingredients they don't use in other countries.
What is it that you want to do now? More. Tell our listeners two things. What are your causes, brand name, let's say, causes, fundamental legal change in terms of regulation, and what would you like our listeners to do? Make sure you give your website, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Come on over to foodbabe.com and sign the Kellogg's petition, where we have, now over 453,000 signatures. Join the movement to take on these American iconic companies for these hypocritical, unethical, immoral, un-American policies that they've been practicing for so long. It's time we change this. This is something I hope to see changed in my generation. The day I die, I hope that American companies will stop poisoning us with ingredients they don't use in other countries. I'd really like to see this stop. And this is, again, not just a Kellogg's issue. It's happening at General Mills, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Mars, all of the big American food companies out there, Kraft Heinz, et cetera. So this is something that we have to come together as American citizens. Poison is not partisan. This is a bipartisan issue. We've got huge momentum. We've got 11 states now looking at banning artificial food dyes. We got California that just enacted a banning of the artificial food dyes in schools. And so we have a tremendous momentum. We have, I have attorney general's offices calling me, talking about law, taking on legal action against some of these corporations. So there's all kinds of things happening where you can get involved and also learn about these issues on foodbabe.com, where I share the latest information. Just last night, I interviewed an ex-FDA expert and asked him about the issues of Kellogg's. His interview was absolutely fascinating. We just published that today. You can go and watch that. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Okay, listeners, no excuses here. Let's get on the drive finally to do something about these corporations by going after, among other things, their very, very valuable brand name. They're not likely to change brand names that they've put hundreds of millions of dollars of advertising into making sure that you see and recognize them instantly. We need more attention to the advertising industry here, which is the way they ingrain in very young children, sometimes age 3, 2, all the way through the lives of consumers, these brand names with very favorable vibrations that their psychologists have maneuvered to attach to these brand names selling deadly products. Thank you very much, Vani Hari.
Thank you so much for having me.
We've been speaking with the food babe, Vani Hari. We will link to her work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, why do the leaders of the labor movement never demand anything from the Democratic Party? But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, November 22, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A massive recall of organic carrots and baby carrots sold at grocery stores across the country was issued by a California grower after a possible outbreak of E. coli that has already killed one person. That's according to a report from CBS News. Grimway Farms, which made and packaged the organic carrots, issued the recall on Saturday after nearly 40 cases were recorded in 18 states. At least 15 people were hospitalized and one person has died. A number of stores that sold the carrots are impacted, including Walmart, Kroger, Albertsons, Publix, Food Lion, Target, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, and Canadian chains Loblaws and Compliments. State and local public health officials are interviewing people about the foods they ate in the week before they got sick. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, Ralph, and the rest of the team. There's a lot wrong about the leadership of the labor movement and a lot right going on at the grassroots. Our next guest will fill us in. David?
Chris Townsend is a 45-year union member and leader. He was most recently the Amalgamated Transit Union International Union Organizing Director. Previously, he was an international representative and political action director for the United Electrical Workers Union, and he has held local positions in both the SEIU and UFCW. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Chris Townsend.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Chris Townsend, listeners, is arguably the most outspoken, experienced labor leader in America today. He's had decades of work inside labor unions, organizing workers. Now he's outside. He and his colleagues have organized 50,000 workers in Virginia, showing the way to these labor leaders who often don't put enough money into organizing the many, many millions of workers that want to be organized for collective bargaining against these large employers. So, Chris, let's start with basically what you wrote in the Capital Citizen that's just out and other outlets. You have an article called Election Day Delirium. Give us the thesis of that in terms of why it turned out the way it did on November 5th.
Sure. The articles, that one and others that I've done, just continuously are a drumbeat to remind observers, union members, other leaders, that we have gone completely off track on so many different tracks. It really is something that Our media largely ignores the labor movement. Our small labor press, left press, generally subscribes to the good news only school of journalism. So these endemic problems and even immediate crises are never dealt with. Now, some of that is because the existing labor leadership generally is not fond of criticism or is not fond of anyone pointing out shortcomings, mistakes, and whatnot. But in the recent election, I'm not sure how you could understate what a disaster this has been for working people, not only in the fact that Trump, a fringe lunatic, anti-labor bigot, that's putting it mildly, that he has been reelected, but the fact that the labor movement was just stalled, spinning its wheels, and that the labor leadership, by all indications, I'm speaking largely of the AFL-CIO, but not entirely, was surprised by this and shouldn't have been. And all of that being said, Ralph, now that the disaster has fallen on us, and we've had, 2 weeks, I see no evidence that there's any emergency mobilization of the labor unions today to build and develop fortifications for what is going to be an historic onslaught against us and our very right to exist in multiple sectors. So I'm not sure where the labor leadership has gone, on vacation after their exhaustion from supporting the Harris machinery. I don't know.
I do know. They're basically bureaucrats in that building on 16th Street, collecting their pay and their nice pensions, completely out of touch with millions of blue-collar workers that have veered into the Republican Party channels, the so-called Reagan Democrats, which have spelled the difference in election after election for Senate, for the House, for the presidency. And I gave them a test. And the test was, to what extent are they going to bow down to the Democratic Party apparatchiks a few blocks away in Washington? To what extent are they going to send millions of labor union dollars coming from the workers for campaign contributions to the Democratic Party, which send contracts out this campaign to the corporate conflicted consulting firms with no strings attached to all this money from the labor unions? And to what extent are they going to automatically endorse Democratic candidates months before the election without any conditions, without any demands, for example, that they go for minimum wage increase to 15 or more per hour, without any demand that they enact card check as part of the labor laws to make it easier for people to join unions? The laws are so obstructive. We're now the worst in the Western world in anti-labor union laws. All of this just comes to one conclusion, that 13 million workers who belong to the unions who are part of the AFL-CIO Federation have been hijacked by corporatism, by a corporate Democratic Party. So we tried to get these labor leaders to make Labor Day, the last Labor Day in September, a workers' day instead of a commercial sales day, by having hundreds of events at the local level centered on a compact for American labor, that the unions would get the Democratic Party around, and that the civic groups would have entry at the local level. They'd be part of these events, as well as inviting candidates for local, state, and national office to endorse the Compact for American Labor. It would have been a tremendous momentum drive for the succeeding 8 weeks to the November election. And certainly it would have made the difference in the 250,000 votes in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan that spelled the defeat of Kamala Harris. I mean, that's what we're doing. Very small margins here. Well, believe it or not, Chris, 6 labor union leaders loved it. The head of the postal workers, the flight attendants union, and others, they loved it. And we took it to Liz Schuler, the head of the AFL-CIO, in that building on 16th Street, and she loved it. So we thought in July, well, this is really going to get underway. They're going to have their locals mobilized. They got their researchers. They got their media people. So we said, let's go. So week 1, nothing. Week 2, 3, what's going on here? And, they've gone dark on us. Well, what happened is they passed this proposal past the Democratic Party in Washington, and the Democratic Party nixed it. They shut it down, saying we can't control what's going on at these local media gatherings. So there you are, right there. The labor union is a tail of the Democratic Party. And
Yeah,
you know
I
that
would
better
agree,
than
Ralph.
anybody.
You're being too generous. We're a cash cow and a vote cow to be milked routinely and extensively by this Democratic machinery. And your effort around Labor Day really presaged what happened in the election. The leadership today in the bulk of the unions is an administrative layer, business union through and through to the core. The historic trade union spirit that always animated the unions in various levels or whatnot is not extinguished. But in my 45 years, I would say it is at a low ebb in the sense that we just have been sterilized because of this unconditional and unholy alliance or domination by the Democratic Party. And there's no room for spark. There's no room for dissent. There's no room for anyone to even raise the obvious. And, you know, what you were doing at Labor Day was essentially raising the obvious need for a revitalization of the labor movement, but you're raising it with an entrenched leadership. And I'm generalizing, but in the bulk of the labor movement, certainly at the AFL-CIO, you know, an entrenched leadership that is comfortable, enormous salaries, great benefits, no great stress in their lives other than travel and living in nice hotels and collecting per diems and speaking ceaselessly to other white-collar groups. I mean, there's no room in here for ordinary working people. And I think Bernie Sanders, although I was disappointed that he spent as much of his own political capital as he did to try to prop up Harris, he did make an effort to redeem himself after the election by pointing out the obvious, that this Democratic Party structure, the DNC and all of its subsidiaries, long ago not only abandoned working people, it actively undermines and attacks them as best, you know, I mentioned in my article. And Ralph, you played the best role that you were able to combat this so-called free trade mania that we are still subjected to, that has only resulted in carnage, destruction of entire industries. And then this is the breeding ground. These workers who have been betrayed, lied to, wrecked, destroyed, poisoned, all of these things. This becomes the breeding ground for Trumpist ideology. And the Democrats won't face this. They refuse to. I mean, here you had Bill Clinton on the campaign. You know, his greatest accomplishment was managing to stay in office. Yet he was traipsed out as some sort of a great leader of the working class. I mean, it defies the boundaries of the imagination to have sat through, as we all did, how the Democrats conducted their campaign and came up so short. Wasn't a surprise to me or to us, but yet we're still stuck with the ramifications of that.
Well, what's even more disturbing is the point you just made earlier. There doesn't seem to be, at least overtly, a sense of urgency, emergency. Replace the leaders in the Democratic Party structure. They lost again and again. They've lost or just squeaked through. You got to have new leadership. You got to bring in young people. You got to open it up to blue collar workers instead of, you know, just these consulting firms. I haven't seen anything in over 2 weeks of anything. Jamie Harrison's resigning, but not because he lost. His last words were rebuking Bernie Sanders for daring to say the Democratic Party lost the working classes because they've ignored the working classes. And he rebuked Bernie Sanders, the most popular poll-tested elected politician in America today. Nobody has his polls like Bernie Sanders. And he called Bernie's statement BS. I mean, they don't even respect the leader of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party after a disastrous loss was registered. And the same is true for the supporters. You put it out, the labor union leaders. I don't see any emergency meetings. Maybe they're doing something behind the scenes, but usually something like that leaks out. I don't see enough citizen groups back home in Washington developing a sense of urgency that they must have, that they cannot continue business as usual. They cannot continue refusing to openly criticize Democratic senators and House of Representatives, Democrats, and about Joe Biden. All that's got to be thrown overboard. We're in a tremendous political crisis in this country, and Trump has all the cards. He's got the Congress, he's got the courts, he manages to be Teflon to any media exposure, and he's got a disorganized and demoralized Democratic Party. So do you see any current at all in the labor movement along the lines of a change of pace, a change of direction, a more conditional labor union to the money they give to the parties or the candidates?
Yeah. But allow me 1 second, Ralph, just to backtrack on something. You know, this Democratic Party is a very large, cumbersome coalition, so to speak. It's not one monolithic organization. The DNC, of course, dominates it, and big business, who provides most of the funding. I mean, look at the astonishing $1 billion+ war chest of Harris. That's a different discussion as opposed to how it was spent. But I am one organizer, one union organizer. I have been at this a long time. I have been through in my career, and I'm still going through, even though I'm retired, I'm still involved in numerous union organizing projects. I have lived from beginning to end through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of union elections. I have more election experience than the entire DNC leadership put together. But these elections are irrelevant to them, and I would not be recognized in any form or fashion as having any valid views on this. Well, the reason I mention this is there's an old adage that every successful union organizer must learn. I certainly learned it, and it was part of my considerable success. And it's the old adage that says, when you are too weak to defend, you must attack. When you are too weak to defend, you must attack. And what we see historically over and over and over again are failed business union leadership trying to hold on to positions that can't be held on to, trying to satisfy some sense of acceptable, dissent on their part. I mean, it's just an absurdity. And in terms of where we find ourselves today, brother, it's yet to be seen. I mean, we're 2 weeks out, not quite, and we are now, the liberals, or as you correctly labeled them, Ralph, the frightened liberals who proliferate through the labor movement and through the Democratic Party, are still in a sense of shock and disbelief and denial. And as we begin to see Trump's picks for cabinet positions and whatnot, I mean, this man is off the rails. Well, what did anyone expect with this character? The way that this is turnabout for him. And in any case, it's yet to be seen where we will see real resistance. I tend to think that it will be in pockets of the labor movement. Our federal workforce, there's several federal unions that are in dire life and death danger. At this point in time, we have continued erosion in manufacturing, despite these absurd pronouncements by Biden and Harris of onshoring jobs and all this. The manufacturing sector remains in recession and shrinkage, and certainly the union component of it. In the services, we now see shrinkage. So I think it's too soon. Hope springs eternal. I think workers will always resist when they have to defend themselves. But I think as the election showed, many of the members are far ahead of where their leaders are in terms of their understanding of the gravity of the situation. So maybe what we're experiencing now is a period where the leadership have to sober up and wake up to the real reality, not only the broad realities of why and how this happened, but even now the exact realities of how we have to resist what is truly going to be a fight for survival. And we've said that in previous elections, and it was a bit of hyperbole. It's not anymore.
Well, fortunately, there are some labor leaders that are very, very good. Sarah Nelson of the flight attendants, Brother Dimmenstein of the postal workers, the head of the UAW, some up-and-coming local labor leaders around the country who know what the score is and what has to be done. SEIU, of course, led the fight for $15 an hour. They've got a pulse. But somehow, when they get together around that big table in 16th Street headquarters with the AFL leadership, they don't have the leverage. They don't have the leverage to turn the rest of them around. But I think your point is well taken, that the more conservative labor leaders have been the federal employee. And now Trump's out to get them. I mean, he's not out to defeat him in collective bargaining. He's got guys coming in there that they want to get rid of the union, period. So maybe now they'll cross the aisle and join some of the people like Nelson and Dimmenstein and begin to turn the tide. I want to quote a statement you made in one of your articles and see what your reaction is. Quote, despite the obvious ruins before us, most labor and left leaders will likely act to prevent any consideration of the obvious disaster. The accumulated labor and left leadership must be compelled to offer detailed reports on the resources allocated, the number of members deployed, the experiences gained, and then accompanied by a balance sheet of what the actual impact really was in the election. The gargantuan political spending of the unions must be examined in detail, as more than $1 billion in members' money has been expended on the overall election debacle. The members paying the dues for this disaster are entitled to a full accounting, end quote. Who's going to force that? It's not going to be a congressional committee, unfortunately, under Republican domination. Who can begin unfurling that ball of yarn, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, I'll say whoever that guy is that said that, he knows what he's talking about, because that's exactly what we're facing. And, listeners may not know, but the political action spending, the propping up of the Democratic Party mostly, is far more expensive than what any of the leadership are prone to have to admit to, because there's tremendous direct and indirect support that goes on. Some of it is justified. Some of it brings some return, so to speak. But when you have an election like we just had, where literally they were shoveling union treasuries into the Harris camp and, well, first the Biden camp and then Harris. Historically, in most of the unions and most of the labor movement, there never is a real true accounting of what this was. And I think that given that the money was so enormous this time, and that the labor unions chose to only selectively mobilize their members in certain states and certain battlegrounds, all based on what know-it-all Democratic consultants told them. I will also point out the bulk of the trade union activity around the election took place in the communities, not in the workplaces. An awful lot of unions don't want to stir a political discussion amongst their members. I mean, we have a situation that's been building for several decades, and it's truly scandalous, which is many of the unions will scientifically poll their own members, knowing that large chunks of them support Republicans. And this time, I haven't seen very many specific reports, but there are several incidences of majorities in certain unions who embrace Trump. But yet the trade union leadership, almost to the last union, a few exceptions, yes, you mentioned a few, they take no steps to educate their members and speak to their members and whatnot. They'll repeat cheap slogans, try to whip things up at the 25th hour, throw money at the problem. Well, this is not going to solve the political disaster in the minds of many of the members who now, in large numbers, vote against their own self-interest, their own class interests. So this has to be faced. But this labor leadership doesn't have to face anything. It's insulated in so many different ways. It's insulated by its economic status due to the enormous salaries. Let's be honest, the vast majority of these unions, there's no political life in the union in the sense that anybody is going to challenge them or have any chance of challenging them successfully, to replace them. So we have a very comfortable, smug, even leadership that just goes on. And this is what I think explains, we now face an all-out attack with heavy weapons, and I don't see very much going on in very many quarters in the labor movement to even acknowledge that, let alone prepare for that.
Let's talk about what you've been doing in Virginia, because you practice what you preach. You've written the following, quote, the left and the labor movement must accept this reality and begin the process of rebuilding a credible political movement of our own, end quote. The reality being the moribund state of organized labor. So tell us what you've been doing and how you've been getting it done in Virginia.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I'm going to expand on that. One national situation and certainly the Virginia situation. I'll mention the Virginia situation. Listeners wouldn't have any way of knowing this, but in the state of Virginia, imagine this. This was the capital of the Confederacy, as south as it gets in terms of trade unionism. Our trade union density here is something slightly more than 3% of the workforce is organized. We're in the last 2 or 3 in the whole rotten pile. But in any case, in the last several years, this is over several years, by my count, and I appear to be the only one who's counting, more than 53,000 workers have joined or voted for a union. Now, for balance, half of that is the gigantic teacher union election that we had here in Fairfax County, where I live, Alexandria, Virginia. Finally, after many decades of collective bargaining being banned, it was partially repealed. And this election took place, and 27,000 teachers chose overwhelmingly to unionize. But out of this 53,000 in the entire state, about 15,000 would be private sector. And I was part of that in my role at the Amalgamated Transit Union. So why do I throw that out there? It's somewhat of an arbitrary number. It might have been 10,000. It might have been 1 million. But the fact is our labor movement has completely slept through this. So here we have a bright spot in our labor movement, and there's no curiosity that I can detect amongst the leadership to say, well, gee, what's happening in Virginia? Or I hear that there's something happening in Virginia. No, zero, nothing. And I can say that because I have exhausted myself trying to reach out to a dozen unions to discuss this, and all with an eye toward helping them or advising them to get into this state to magnify this and benefit themselves from this. So there's the curiosity has disappeared. On the national state, I want to say something that's even more shocking than that, exponentially more shocking than that. The Starbucks union organizing movement. Folks wouldn't know, Ralph, I think you know, but the Starbucks union organizing was the product of an organizing school that Larry Hanley, he was the president of the ATU, he's deceased now, sadly. Larry Hanley, Richard Bensinger, lifetime organizer, and myself started the Inside Organizer School. Anybody interested, insideorganizerschool.com.org, either one. Anyway, we started that school in 2018. By 2019, the Starbucks movement came together, led by Richard Bensinger, and it's off to the races. So why do I bring this up in this same breath? I think folks might have noticed right before our November election, our political election, that the 500th Starbucks store unionized. Just before that, it achieved a tiny Richter, 1.0 in our media, but 500 Starbucks stores have now unionized successfully, facing an all-out anti-labor bigot corporation of epic proportions, and yet the organizing wave continues. Well, the reason I mention this is in the same sense of the extinguishment of the curiosity by the labor leadership. Not one single member of the AFL Executive Council, any large union of any consequence, has ever contacted myself or Richard Bensinger to even ask the question, wow, isn't that amazing? How did you do that? What went into that? The curiosity is not even there. It's just sort of like, oh, well, that's a great thing. Now, this is historic. We say that about a lot of things in the labor movement, but there haven't been 500 successful union elections, maybe in any company, let alone in 3-4 year period. It's not gigantic in the term of the numbers because of the small size. It's about 11 or 12,000 workers, and it shows all indications of continuing. So that's a whole other discussion. But when I put those two things out on the table, here we have this dramatic uptick of union organizing in a state like Virginia. It is ignored. It is unknown. A small fry figure like Chris Townsend has to keep track of it and discover it. And then just as outrageously, this Starbucks movement comes. And it's not even, again, you might have thought in both cases that the national labor movement would have dropped things and said, let's look at what's happening in these two situations. But there's nothing. I think it's explained by their preoccupation with other things, the Democratic Harris campaign, amongst other things. But it really is a worrisome piece. This will not be the most sexy sounding, of two things to mention. But what does it say about our labor movement and, of course, our labor leadership that these two things, Virginia and Starbucks, can unroll and they're not even noticed?
They're bright spots. One of them is the first timid step of some labor unions in the AFL-CIO to criticize the Netanyahu genocide in Gaza. Historically, listeners, you might know that the organized U.S. labor movement was whipped into a frenzy against communist organizing workers abroad, and they joined the U.S. empire and the military-industrial complex for decades. And this is really, I think, a breakthrough led by a couple people like Mr. Bruskin, who we had on our show, going to the labor unions and saying, you can't continue to ignore this issue. It's corrupting Congress. It's suppressing civil liberties and civil rights and free speech in this country. And the Israeli lobby has to be taken into account. So they did that. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone.
I want to thank our guests again, Vani Hari and Chris Townsend. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each program. Go to the comments section of ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Again, the new issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen is out. It has articles like Labor Leaders Leave Workers in Lurch, Nuclear Svengali on Capitol Hill, Congressional hearings aren't what they used to be, Wuthering Heights, Congress bows down to Biden, and a tribute by Bruce Fine to the late Vanier Congressman Walter B. Jones from North Carolina, Republican. Those are just some of the many articles in this 40-page packed newspaper, print only. Capitol Citizen, go to capitolcitizen.com. For a donation of $5 or more, you get a copy. You can get extra copies for your reading circle or for libraries, as some of the listeners know. And you can become a Capitol Hill citizen yourself. If we don't recover Congress, the only branch left that's accessible to us, for obvious reasons, the vote, but in between elections, if we don't start leverage Congress, we're going to have a great deal of trouble with Führer Donald J. Trump.
And you rise up, stand up, and you rise up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up.